Alrighty, you've just gone and finished your handle. As you can see, it's got a lovely taper coming from top down to bottom, and it looks super tasty. We're going to leave the tape on here for just now, so don't go ahead and rip that off. Keep that on there. The next step is to go through and make our mallet head. As you can see, it's pretty good. Now, the very first step is, of course, measuring this up to be 120 meters long and then cutting it down straight. Now, there is a reason we don't cut the tapers into it straight away, and that's because we want to make sure that we're getting the tapers the angle that we actually need them to be, and so that we still have square edges to mark off for getting this central in it. That is super important because we can always make our mallet head a little bit thinner, but we can't fix up a skewed thing. And what I've found in the past is students often tend to not cut these to the right angle, and so it becomes harder when measuring this up. So let's get back into this and let's keep going. So to go through and create that mallet head, we're going to need a piece of 70 by 32, and we're going to need at least 245 millimeters of it. Now, I'm not sure what I've got in front of me. It looks just shy of 300, so we're going to have a little bit of scrap. From here, let's go through and let's begin to mark this up. Now, I happen to know that these edges are square, but they don't actually have to be. As long as you've got a representation of what square is, we're fine. Now, because mine is square, excellent. If yours are a bit skew-if, just grab that pencil and draw on a square line to work from. Perfect. Now, the next step we want to come through and do is we want to measure in 120 millimeters from that square edge, because as you can see here, our mallet head at max is going to be 120 millimeters. So coming through, pulling this down, I'm going to rip out 120 millimeters and mark that there. From here, I'm going to grab my square and I'm going to bring this across and set this up and drag this down because we want to get a nice cut coming through there. Boom, we've got a nice square edge to cut there, and I'm going to get straight in and cut it. Now, the reason I'm going to cut one first and then the other is because I think it minimizes problems. Otherwise, students tend to measure, and then cut, and so one will always be smaller. Now, to minimize issues with cutting on a weird angle, so cutting on a bit of an angle coming across here like that, it's really handy to grab that square once more and to draw this line coming down both sides. So set that up and then draw that on. And then what I do to one, I do to the other as well. So I'm going to come through and set that up and draw that down. Now I've got this coming around, I can actually see the angle of my cut. Remember, I always like to cut slightly oversized because I can always cut down, but I can't ever add timber to a piece. So I would rather cut oversized and then sand down if required. From there, set this up. I bring it back 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and then I go for my cut. Okay, I've got one cut here. I'm going to go through now and measure up the second one. I'm going to use the opposite square edge because this piece is just going to be scrap anyway. From here, we've got our two pieces. Now, they're not exactly 120 millimeters each. They are slightly out, and it's time to go fix these up. Now, it's probably not great practice, but I always recommend popping back over that disc sander and sanding them up because, well, it's easier to sand them down and get them more accurate than to try something else. So we're back over at this disc sander here. You're going to need some safety glasses. You're going to need your hair tied up into making sure that there's no loose strands. You're going to make sure that you've got no bangles on, no jewelry on, and of course any loose sleeves or anything are tied up. Make sure that your apron straps are once again also removed. Checking that this is once again, of course, running square, which mine is from an earlier use. Come through and grab your piece. Now we want to sand down just to the line here, and we want to get them both exact. On a larger sander, you could potentially tape these together and then sand, but mine would struggle with the size of that, and so I'm just going to do one at a time, holding them up against this edge here. Alrighty, so we are here, and for this we're gonna need pretty much all of our stuff. So you're gonna have your handle with you and your two heads. The very first step we need to go through and do is, of course, draw a center line down our two heads. But before we can do that, we wanna have a look at this end grain, and we wanna see how we want our end grain to be looking. As you can see, if we've got them both going that way, it doesn't look the best. If we've got one going one way and one the other, it's fine, it's not the greatest. So let's start spinning and seeing what we can do to try and get these to look attractive. Now, I personally like the big arch that we're going to get on this one, and that's going to be replicated here. So it's going to create a nice large arch coming through, and I think that's the way to go. So for me, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to get my pieces here. I'm going to flip them out like this. So we've got 1 and 2. I'm just going to go A and B, or A and A, so that I know the A's go together. They're going to come through and go together like that. Perfect. Next step is we need to find the midway point between the two of these. Now, once again, if you've got your ruler, you can come through and set that to, or you should be able to go through and set this to 60. Once again, Carbotech. Otherwise, you can come through and use your metal rule, because of course you want to double check that these are 120 mils, which mine are, and mark at that 60 millimeter mark right near that top edge. 60 mils, or a quicker way is to come through, set that up there, and just have that set and mark that at 60 mils. From there, we're going to need that square again, coming through, setting that square up, place that on, and draw your mark back. Your line back. Once again, what you do to one, we want to do to the other here. So we've now got our two pieces with our lines central. We need to come through, we'll move these up out of the way for now. And we need to come through and we need to get our center line coming down here. Now, this is where it can be a little bit confusing, but ultimately you come down to one end, and mine is sitting at 29.5 millimeters. So I'm going to take that as 29.5 divided by 2 is 14.75. So I'm just going to mark mine at 15 millimeters. And then we can come down to the other end and do the same here. But this time we need to measure the edge, which is up the top here. I've got this sitting at 41 millimeters. So I'm just going to do that at 20.5 millimeters. 20.5 millimeters, like so. And from there, I can now get my metal rule. And I can bring this down, set that up. And I'm going to change this one out for the 600 millimeter ruler on this one, because it is slightly... It'll just give me a little bit better grasp, I think, overall. So I can just see it extend out past the lines, which make it a little bit easier and nicer to work with. It's a bit finicky getting it right to where it needs to be, but once you've got that there, making sure you've got that sharp pencil and draw your line in. We want to presume that this is accurate, but we don't know. So we need to draw the exact same line on the back side, making sure to do our measurements again. So what I've gone through and done here is I've got the side A1 here, and the A1 of our handle connects to the A1 of our side here. Now that's super important, because it means that if for some reason your handle's not quite accurate or right, you're going to be able to get a better fit this way using this technique. So let's get back to it over here and let's progress. Now the next step is aligning these two features, and they're actually pretty difficult to align. So we're going to grab our trusty square one more time. I'm going to draw around the edge. Now you don't have to draw the whole way this time. I'm just going to come through and draw about halfway, so I know exactly which side I'm working on. So you're going to end up having a nice follow around there, and we're going to do the same on the other side. So we've got this coming up and around and around. This means that when I'm going to come through and stick this here, it's going to be easy for me to align these two lines here. And that's what we're doing. But first, we need to come through here and we need to mark down. I'd love to see you mark down about 40, actually let's go, 40 millimeters. So once again, I'm just going to use my little trusty ruler here to come through and mark this center line here, 40 millimeters. Now this can be more difficult when trying to go through and draw yourself a square line, because this is no longer square, this piece. So look, come down and draw the angle from both sides there. And for one of those rare moments, join the two outside lines that you've just drawn and draw yourself on a line there. What you do to one side, you should go through and do the other. So once again, bringing this across, marking to 40 millimeters, coming through. Double checking that one, it's the furthest bottom. And we're going to come through and draw this on. This just means that when this is done, we're going to have a little bit of playroom here so that this handle head doesn't come up over the top, which is a common issue that students end up making. So we're going to give ourselves 40 mils in case we cut a little bit wide, it can sit up a little bit closer to the top edge. We've got this sitting up nice and neat here, and we need to align these two lines. Now it's pretty annoying and pretty hard to do. I see I can get one done, and then the top one is, mine's still accurate, right? So mine's still pretty good to where it needs to be. And for this, now I'm going to use two hands, and this is where it can be handy to have a second person to help out. But I'm going to flip this over, making sure it hasn't moved at all. Check and check. I'm going to draw in the angle or the taper that needs to be cut into this piece. Once again, it can be difficult to do, so take your time, making sure to give yourself some nice crisp lines. After you've got those crisp lines, you're going to see that there's a slight taper. It's ever so slight. It's very small, but that's okay. Once you've done that to one, we're then going to go through and do it to the other one. We've got that there, 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 and there. From here, we've got our pieces ready to go. The next step we need to do is to mark down these edges so that we know where we're cutting. I personally keep favoring this tiny square, and once again, if Christmas is coming, it doesn't hurt to ask mum and dad or somebody else for a baby square. Now, one of your issues with squares is getting squares that are going to be absolutely perfect, which is why you'll notice that I've actually gone through and utilized a engineer's square instead of using a traditional woodworking square. And the reason I do that is because ultimately, if I'm honest, I don't particularly care about where it's coming from. I care about the quality of it. Now, if you are wanting a crazy good square, from what I hear, there's a company called Woodpeckers, which do an incredible square. But I believe they're also ridiculously expensive. So I'm very happy with my set from Groz, but even 3 squares from Groz, which I picked up from Carbotech, were very expensive. But I have no regrets on them whatsoever as of yet. Now, if you are going to get a square and you do plan on bringing it to school, I'd recommend getting one that doesn't match these school squares, because that way nobody tries to put it back with the school slots. So we've got this here, We're looking stoked, okay? This is looking great. The next step is to go in and mark out the rest of the mortise. Now, for that, we're going to need a marking gauge. Alrighty, guys, we've got these all marked up, but it's time to just mark in how deep the mortise needs to be. For that, you need to grab your handle and rip off any tape on it. This is a perfect time to go ahead and write your name on all of your pieces to make sure that you don't get them stolen by another student or somebody else. I've got my handle there, and it's time for us to go through and measure the thickness of our handle. So the thickness is to turn our piece on the side like this, and then measure the width there. Now, yours should be 19 millimeters, but it's always handy to check. Mine is not. Mine is 17 millimeters. And so for 17 millimeters, I need to divide that in half. Whatever measurement you get, you need to divide by 2. If you struggle with maths, please whip your calculator out and check it out, because it's very important to get this right. Now for mine, from there, you need to come through and get yourself a marking gauge. From here, you can set this up, grab your metal rule out, and mark this up against the tip of your gauge, the very point there. And I'm going to set mine to 8.5 millimeters. So I've got this ever so lightly, so I can just shift it with my thumb. Still needs a little bit of pressure to shift it. I'm going to put that at 8.5. And once again, it can be a bit of a pain. That's 8.5 there. I'm going to tighten the back up. Now, it's important to come through and always check to make sure that your pieces are the same. If you've got a bit of offcut, that's when you could use that offcut. But for me, I'm just going to come through and I'm going to just draw a light dot in the back of my piece here. So I've gone through, done a light dot there, like so. I'm then going to come through from the other side and draw another light dot. And what you're going to notice here is that my measurements, because we start to deal in 0.5 millimeters, as you can see, it starts to not align. So there's about 1 mil between that. So I need to move this another 0.5 mil closer to or further away from the point. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to come through and set that up. I'm happy with that. And set that up. And they've now hit the same spot. Once again, it's a handy trick to do, and I'm just going to sand this off later. I'll take the mill down. So instead of being 300 mils long, it might be 295 mils long. 299.5 mil long. Alrighty, we've got our pieces here. We've now got our marking gauge ready and set up to go.
Using that marking gauge, the very important thing is to keep the head of that marking gauge flat up against the face of your piece. If that's not done, you're going to have a world of trouble. Then from there, you just want to tilt it down until the blade is slightly touching the piece, and then move along. Now, you don't want to go the whole way along. You just want to go within your lines. Otherwise, you look like a little bit of a silly duffer. So, just within those lines, go most of the way to one line, then tilt back and come back in from the other way. This ensures that you never overshoot and effectively damage your piece. So that's the goal. Now, one of the ways you want to go through and define that is to go through and add a pencil mark in there. It just really helps you identify and see what's going on. But let's say that that's a bit hard. Well, the next way is to put it in a vise. I actually love putting things in a vise whenever I can because it minimizes the holding that I have to do. If I can clamp it in one way or another, that's the better system in my mind. And as you can see here, I'm able to do this with much less stress. So go through, do this to both pieces, and then let's move on to the next section.
We've got our two pieces set up there with our lines coming across there.